Now, why did we choose to go for artillery? Once level 1 factories and then level 2, 3, and 4 followed by that are unlocked, you slowly get additional options for mechanized units. Cavalry is super great in the early game. If you can afford the food and the fish upkeep and 6,000 in cash, this is a really great way to get an additional 15 attack. At some point, having a stack over 50,000 infantry doesn't give you any additional attack damage, as only the first 20 fight at full damage, and the rest up to 50 fight at reduced damage. If we take a look at the stack here, you can see it's capped off at 50, and it'll tell you that the first 50 most powerful units deal the damage. But if we look at a stack of 23, let's say here, it'll tell you that only the 20 most powerful units deal the full damage. So the cavalry is nice to have right away. Day one as well, getting a few armored cars out too with your workshops is going to be tremendous. They'll give you a huge defensive boost, just given the fact that they have a defense of 12, and then they have a really nice 60 hit points, which means you're going to be taking less casualties, as even some of the damage meant for your infantry is going to be dispersed with those armored cars. So you'll be surprised at some of the fights that you are winning. Your trades are that much better. Now, you'll take some hit point damage. You'll have to regenerate, be it the infantry or the armored cars, but you're going to preserve a lot more troops in the long run. Outside of a few, or initially, armored cars really aren't worth it again until you start dealing with bombers. I believe I've said it a few times, but they do have a really good air defense of 8, and they're fast. They're going to be a lot faster than your balloons here, which also have the 8s, but they are significantly slower. Once you get into the factory production, you get 4 additional units plus airplanes that you have to decide what works best in your situation. If you have a province on the coast, then it may be worth investing in naval. A lot of times, from a naval engagement standpoint, the one with the more battleships will win most of the engagements, especially if you have a proper escort of infantry to act as meat shields. Focusing on light cruisers is important if you have opponents that are on the coast or there's AI countries you plan to attack. If you can just peddle them with a few cruisers, force them to come out to you, or just do some additional damage, this will be huge. Let's say your opponent is also building a lot of factories and harbors on the coast. Just having a few of these will essentially cripple that production. It may delay it. It may stop it entirely. You'll mess with most likely double resource provinces. So a ton of huge wins, though they do have a shorter range than artillery with only... Does it not tell me? Attack range. There we go. It was right in front of me. Attack range of 40. So artillery should have, I believe, a 50? Yeah, 50. So artillery will be effective against dealing with cruisers. Cruisers do not have a lot of hit points, only 50. But then the goal will be to get the battleships. The additional damage, the additional range will pay for itself. A battleship army is almost, in almost all situations, is going to win up against light cruisers. They're so much deadlier when it comes to mopping up a lot of territory on land. They can outrange artillery. Really, they're only going to be losing to railguns or bombers themselves. If your opponent does go bombers, it is important to then start mixing in light cruisers, as light cruisers have a really nice 10 air defense, whereas if you look at the battleship, you only have 6. And again, a battleship costs about 3 times the production time, 5 times the iron, 5 times the coal, a little bit more oil, and then it costs wood, a lot more cash. If you cannot contest the sea, then the recommendation would be to go for a submarine force. You're able to get a good amount of damage against naval, an entire 40 with 100 hit points. With 2 submarines, preferably 3, you can start sinking battleships, and if you're able to amass a larger force, especially if your opponent starts to split up, you'll be able to destroy his naval forces and start slowly contesting the sea back again potentially putting you in a position to create battleships of your own to put pressure again on the land. I mean, the beauty about battleships is that you can use them to contest other land areas, whereas submarines, you are limited to the sea. Submarines can also scout, so it's nice to mix in maybe a submarine or two early game just for scouting purposes so you know what you're up against. A cool little trick is actually stationing some infantry with your submarines, having them patrol maybe an area where you expect your opponent to have some submarines, and force your opponent to go after, let's say, a stack of one or two with a single submarine, whereas you have two or three taking the trade and clearing out these sea lanes, which you normally wouldn't be able to do without a fighter or a bomber kind of patrolling the sea, as these units are invisible. Absent a need to go for Navy, we're still left with the decision of artillery, tanks, heavy tanks, and railroad guns. Artillery would be available very early on, so even if you plan on going for something else, you'll almost always want to go for some artillery pieces just due to the additional options it creates for you, be it going after AI miners. As you can imagine, no one likes being peppered by artillery shells, so a lot of times they will attack you. But even if you're going up against another player, by having that artillery, it forces them to make a decision. Similar to what we just discussed for Missouri, we were able to get Missouri to attack us because we had some artillery. He knew that time was not on his side, and he needed to make an action. Unfortunately, I believe it was the wrong action and left them exposed, but that is the beauty of artillery. Doesn't have the most damage. It's exposed, especially vulnerable to counter artillery fire or rail guns or bombers or anything if it doesn't have a proper escort and if it's too close to the front lines. Let's bring up the pen again, and let's say that the front line was just these four little provinces here, and instead of going through Missouri, we actually were up against a large player that had a significant borders just to the northeast from us, and it really wasn't possible to kind of go for flanking maneuvers, and both of us had high morale provinces right here. We had a lot of fortifications already, key resources. In that situation, I would be going for the artillery. You have very defendable positions. You're able to come out a little bit, do a lot of damage against your opponent. The general rule with artillery pieces of your own is that they don't need an escort really early into artillery production if you know your opponent either doesn't have artillery production or is still a little ways away. You don't need that escort necessarily. You do want a buffer in front of the territory that you're bombing, but you wouldn't need to garrison a force with the artillery itself. But as soon as your opponent has artillery of their own, if we flip back over here to this pointer, if you look at YOLO here, let's reset this. You can't do this, because if your opponent has artillery pieces here, they can fire at your artillery directly, and there is no infantry to soak up that damage, even if you had 20 artillery pieces and your opponent only had 5. Each shot barrage that they take will be dwindling down your artillery count, whereas if they have a fortification, they might not even be losing any infantry. So it's never wise to go into a situation like this if you are attacking a fort and you do have numerical superiority with the artillery. It would be better to have a little bit of a blocker up in front, enough to deal with any kind of a counterattack, then also additional infantry that you can station with your artillery so that each tick of fire, you don't lose your precious artillery that are very expensive, but instead you're using up some cheap infantry. Unfortunately, it is cannon fodder, meat shields, whatever you want to call it. But when you're in a situation where you have a lot of open contested ground without a lot of fortification, low morale, I would make an argument that you would want to focus on tank production. You're able to get units with a lot of hit points and a lot of damage, both on offense or defense. Heavy tanks having 260 with 45 offense and 45 defense. If you're able to get these units out into the field, you would be able to defeat any kind of isolated stacks. If you have a situation, and I'm looking at South Dakota here, where your opponent has a lot of valuable territory just past the front line, and the front line is not heavily fortified. In that situation, I would go for Marco. I would be building regular tanks, and I would try to find a vulnerable position on the front line where I could go through and then maybe split off a few troops, maybe a tank, maybe even force march it, where I can start securing a lot of territories and causing a lot of havoc, or going after key production, artillery, and so on. Unfortunately, North Dakota, their morale is super low, so even if I built a regular tank army and I broke through here with speed and took over all these territories, it really wouldn't impact him that much, because a lot of his strength right now is in his infantry. He's got a ton of infantry. These provinces are not giving him any resources. You can make the argument that this double wood is giving a surplus along with this double food, but if you look at this double gas, it doesn't even hit the 2400 break even. So he's spiraling. And before we go into South Dakota in too much more detail, you could see that we are going after heavy tank production. We do have an artillery piece here. Artillery is always useful, but we will be going after the heavy tanks. Railroad guns would be nice too, but if, again, you look at these open areas, I built some artillery, or I built some railroad guns here. Well, I mean, there's really nothing to shoot at here. The fight isn't by railroads. It's not in concentrated core territory of mine. Railroad guns are really good on the defensive, but they're not going to be helpful here. Should we have run up to some really tough resistance up here in the north, and they have more artillery, they have level 5 forts, and we really can't break through it, maybe we make the play of building railroads to try to get us close to the front, building our own railroad guns to then start slowly chipping away using that range advantage. But that would be very long and tedious, and that's not what we need in this situation. We can break this. So by going for these heavy tanks, we've got one in production in the north, and I believe we have a second one in the south. Once this level 3 factory finishes, we should be able to begin construction on this heavy tank, and we'll be able to amass a force of 2 and then hopefully 5 heavy tanks. And what we're going to do is, instead of trying to do a breakthrough with regular tanks, I want the heavy tanks with the most hit points, the most attack damage we can concentrate, and we will be going after these fortified positions to start clearing away a lot of his infantry. The units closer to his core territory do have a decent amount morale, but some of these other troops that are stationed in these lower morale provinces, I mean, 33%, that's insane, are extremely vulnerable, and I don't want these troops regrouping into his core territory where he would potentially be able to heal them up, and they would pose a much larger threat than they are right now. This is a fight where I don't believe resources are going to make a huge impact. It's about dwindling the infantry. So by causing heavy casualties in the east and causing a distraction, we will take our artillery units in an area that has some fortifications, has some core valuable infrastructure, and we will start peppering that, forcing him to commit additional troops in this area and allow us to do additional damage. He may commit additional troops in the area, but we would be able to use a blocker. I don't see any artillery of his own, and I would be happy to take the status quo here, because it would mean that we're damaging the morale and the production of one of his key provinces. Whereas if we took artillery and, had him sitting around over here in this area, I'm not doing much damage. He's got the fortification. I have to commit a large army and terrible province morale, whereas this one's right on the border here that I can reach. Both of them, actually. And with that, we'll see you all in the next one.